January 29th, 1945, Holzheim, Germany. At 0417 hours, Sergeant Leonard A. Funk Jr. crouched in a frozen drainage ditch 400 yards from the German-held village, watching his commanding officer's face twist with doubt. The captain had called Funk's patrol plan suicide twice in the past 10 minutes. Now he was using stronger words. Funk stood 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed 145 pounds. The Thompson M1A1 submachine gun slung across his chest weighed 10 pounds 12 ounces. The weapon looked oversized against his small frame, like a child carrying his father's rifle. 3 combat jumps into Sicily, Italy, and Normandy had taught Funk that size didn't matter when you moved fast enough and hit hard enough. The Silver Star pinned inside his jacket pocket confirmed what his frame denied. He was C Company's most decorated non-commissioned officer in the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, and he had earned that distinction by doing exactly what his officers thought was impossible. The captain stabbed his finger at the map spread across the hood of a jeep. Intelligence estimates put between 40 and 60 German soldiers scattered throughout Holzheim, with another 150 to 200 Wehrmacht troops in the surrounding woods. The Battle of the Bulge had collapsed weeks earlier, and German units were retreating east in various states of disorganization. But disorganized didn't mean harmless. The 62nd Volksgrenadier Division had been identified in this sector, and those men knew how to fight. Funk's plan was to take 12 men on a dawn patrol, clear the village of German stragglers, capture prisoners, and secure a farmhouse on the eastern edge as an observation post. The farmhouse sat 80 yards from known German positions. Intelligence had marked it on the map with red ink and labelled it perfect ambush site. The captain wanted to know if Funk understood mathematics. 13 Americans against possibly 200 Germans within a 2-mile radius. Those weren't odds. That was assisted suicide with extra steps. Funk explained, as he had explained twice already, that the Germans were demoralized, exhausted from their failed offensive, and more interested in surviving than fighting. The captain asked what happened if Funk was wrong. Funk said they'd be fine. They shipped out before Funk's rifle arrived from the States. He had spent the Atlantic crossing, watching other men clean their M1 Garans while his personal weapon sat in a warehouse in Illinois. He requested it be forwarded through military mail, a request that earned laughter from the supply sergeant who processed the paperwork. 6 weeks later, in late December, a wooden crate marked fragile caught up with him at the front. Inside was the Winchester Model 70 he had saved 2 years of National Guard pay to buy. The armourer at Camp Forest in Tennessee had asked if it was meant for deer or Germans. Funk explained it was for the Japanese. Nobody told him the plans had changed. The rifle stayed in Illinois. The Thompson came with him to Europe. Regulations said NCOs should carry the M1 carbine, lighter and more practical for leadership duties. Funk insisted on the Thompson. The weapon weighed more than the carbine, fired a slower, heavier .45 ACP cartridge with an effective range of only 50 yards, but in close quarters, nothing else delivered the same devastating firepower or created the same psychological impact. The Thompson didn't just kill people, it announced itself. The sound alone could stop fights before they started. Funk carried 6 spare 30-round stick magazines in a canvas bag. That gave him 180 rounds total, plus the magazine already seated in the weapon. Most NCOs carried 3 magazines and considered themselves well armed. Funk had learned, in 3 combat jumps, that when you went looking for trouble with only 12 men, you brought enough ammunition to make the other side reconsider their choices. The temperature stood at 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Light snow had fallen during the night, and visibility extended roughly 200 yards in the grey pre-dawn darkness. The terrain was agricultural, frozen fields divided by stone walls and scattered tree lines. Holzheim consisted of perhaps 40 buildings, mostly stone construction, clustered around a central square. The farmhouse Funk wanted sat on the eastern edge, two-story stone and timber construction with a barn attached. Smoke had been rising from its chimney the previous afternoon. At 05:45 hours, the 13-man patrol departed American lines and moved east through the frozen fields. They maintained tactical spacing, 5 yards between men, weapons ready. The first German position they encountered at 06:17 hours was an empty bunker showing signs of recent evacuation. Funk studied the discarded equipment and estimated the Germans had pulled out within the past 12 hours. They were running, not regrouping. By 06:38 hours, the patrol reached the village edge. Buildings showed clear signs of occupation. More smoke from chimneys, footprints in the snow, the faint sound of voices. Funk signalled his men to bypass the village centre and approach the farmhouse from the north, using a tree line for concealment. At 07:02 hours, they reached the farmhouse perimeter. The building stood exactly where intelligence had marked it. Stone walls at least 18 inches thick, timber upper story, barn attached on the south side, cellar entrance visible near the foundation. Funk raised his fist and the patrol froze. For 8 minutes they watched. Shadows moved behind windows. Voices speaking German drifted through gaps in the walls. Funk counted the shadows and estimated at least 15, possibly 20 soldiers inside. His men crouched in the snow and waited for orders while their sergeant calculated whether 13 Americans could capture a building full of Germans before breakfast. At 08:30 hours, Funk briefed his assault plan in whispers that fogged the frozen air. 8 men would surround the farmhouse, covering every exit. 4 would provide overwatch from elevated positions with clear fields of fire. The entry would be shock tactics, overwhelming firepower impression delivered before the Germans inside could process what was happening. Funk would go through the door first with the Thompson, because the Thompson was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. The sound it made in an enclosed space didn't just announce American presence, it announced American dominance. The German soldiers inside had heard that Americans were cautious, methodical, reluctant to take risks this late in the war when victory seemed inevitable. They had heard Americans preferred artillery and air power to close combat, that they moved slowly and telegraphed their intentions. Funk was about to teach them that intelligence reports didn't always match reality. By 08:44 hours, his team was in position. Funk stood beside the farmhouse door with 2 men stacked behind him. Across the building, at the barn entrance and the rear door and the cellar access, other Americans waited for his signal. Funk raised his hand, made a fist, and punched it forward. The door exploded inward under a boot heel. Funk entered, firing a burst from the Thompson into the ceiling. The noise in the confined space was deafening, disorienting, a physical pressure that struck eardrums like a fist. 18 German soldiers sat around a wooden table eating breakfast with their weapons stacked against the wall 15 feet away. They froze with forks halfway to mouths, with bread still in their hands, with coffee cups suspended in mid-air. Funk shouted in German, Hände hoch, and 18 pairs of hands rose toward the ceiling. The systematic disarmament took 4 minutes. 12 Carabiner 98K rifles, 3 MP40 submachine guns, a collection of stick grenades, pistols and combat knives were collected and carried outside. The prisoners were a mixture of ages, teenagers who looked terrified and men in their 40s who looked relieved. Their uniforms showed insignia from various units, stragglers and remnants collected together into an improvised defensive group. They claimed they wanted to surrender anyway, that they were exhausted from the Bulge fighting and just wanted the war to end. One of them mentioned more soldiers in the cellar. Funk descended the stone staircase at 08:51 hours with the Thompson leading. The cellar was dark, crowded, and smelled of unwashed bodies and damp earth. His eyes adjusted to reveal 35 more German soldiers packed into a space measuring roughly 20 by 30 feet. They had been sleeping, trying to stay warm, waiting for orders that would never come. Now they stared at an American sergeant with a submachine gun and raised their hands without being told. The count stood at 53 prisoners. Funk had brought 13 men on this patrol. The ratio was now 4 Germans for every American, and standard doctrine said never to exceed 3 to 1 because the mathematics became unmanageable. Funk sent a runner back to American lines requesting a reinforcement and settled in to wait. At 09:23 hours, 12 more Germans approached the farmhouse from the village. They were looking for their comrades, probably wondering why the breakfast group hadn't returned. Funk let them walk through the door and repeated the shock capture. The Thompson ceiling burst, the shouted command, the hands rising. By 09:47 hours, a third group arrived, 8 soldiers who met the same fate. At 10:15 hours, a fourth group of 11 soldiers walked into the trap. The running count reached 84 German prisoners. The ratio climbed to 6.5 to 1. Funk's men were nervous. One of them said this was getting out of hand. Funk told them to keep the prisoners scared and keep them separated. His tactic was simple. Germans in different rooms, constant guard rotation, maintained the impression of overwhelming force even when the mathematics said otherwise. The prisoners remained cooperative. They were war-weary, most of them either too young or too old for frontline service. Volkssturm militia, mixed with Wehrmacht regulars who had seen too much combat and wanted to see home again. By 10:42 hours, the situation appeared stable. Funk used the radio to report his success to the company commander, who responded with a tone that mixed disbelief and admiration. 84 prisoners captured by 13 men. A relief patrol was dispatched with an estimated arrival time of 30 minutes. Funk allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. He had proven the captain wrong about the mathematics. 13 men could capture 84 Germans if those 13 men moved fast enough and hit hard enough. Then he heard the sound of vehicle engines in the distance. Multiple engines, diesel, approaching from the west. Funk moved to a window and looked through a gap in the boards. 3 Opel Blitz trucks were rolling up the road with infantry marching in formation behind them. He counted approximately 80 soldiers visible in the column, and these weren't stragglers wearing mismatched uniforms. These were combat troops with full equipment and organized command structure. Funk did the calculation quickly. 80 arriving plus 84 prisoners equaled 164 Germans minimum, against his 13 Americans. The new ratio was 12 to 1, and worse, the arriving Germans were armed, alert, and moving with purpose. He grabbed the radio and called his company commander. "We have a situation," he said. "Large German force arriving." The response came back asking him to hold if possible. Relief patrol was 15 minutes out. Funk looked at the approaching trucks and knew that 15 minutes might as well be 15 hours. At 10:52 hours, the German truck stopped outside the farmhouse. A German officer climbed down from the lead vehicle and studied the building. He wore a Hauptmann's insignia, a captain, and he moved like a man who had commanded troops through hard fighting. He could see American guards through the windows. He counted them, assessed their positions, and walked toward the door with the confidence of a man who understood exactly what kind of situation he was facing. At 10:55 hours, the Hauptmann called out in English, "American Sergeant, we have you surrounded. Release our men immediately." Funk responded through the closed door. "Your men are prisoners. We're holding this position." The Hauptmann's laugh carried clearly through the wooden planks. "You are perhaps 15 men. I have 110 men here, and more arriving. Be reasonable." Neither side moved for 3 minutes. The standoff hung in the frozen air like a held breath. Then at 10:58 hours, the Hauptmann ordered his soldiers to surround the farmhouse completely. German troops flowed around the building like water, taking positions that covered every exit, every window, every possible escape route. Machine guns were set up, MG-42s capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute. Funk watched the deployment and corrected his earlier count. The Hauptmann had at least 110 soldiers visible, probably more in reserve positions. At 1104 hours, the Hauptmann approached the door again with an offer. The Americans could release their prisoners and withdraw with their weapons. No reprisals, no revenge. "Soldier to soldier," the German captain said. "You fought well. Now be smart." Funk asked for time to consult with his men. What he actually did was radio back to his company. Relief patrol status? The answer came back that traffic was delayed at a bridge crossing. 10 minutes out. Funk told the Hauptmann he needed 10 minutes to decide. The German officer checked his watch and said 5 minutes. Then we come in. Inside the farmhouse, the German prisoners began talking among themselves. They had heard their officer's voice. They knew rescue had arrived. The mood shifted immediately. Captured soldiers who had been cooperative and quiet now stood up, moved toward windows, talked in louder voices. One of Funk's men said the prisoners were slipping away from American control. At 1109 hours, the Hauptmann shouted that time was up. The Germans prepared to assault. The Hauptmann gave orders for tear gas first, then entry. Funk made his final calculation and realized he couldn't win a firefight against these numbers, couldn't hold the prisoners, couldn't escape. At 1113 hours, German soldiers fired tear gas canisters through the farmhouse windows. Grey smoke filled the rooms. Funk's men coughed and their eyes watered and they couldn't see. The prisoners moved toward the doors. At 11:15 hours, Germans breached all entrances at once. 30 Wehrmacht soldiers flooded into the farmhouse with professional speed. They moved through the tear gas like they had done this 100 times before. They disarmed Funk's men within 90 seconds. Every American weapon was taken. Every piece of equipment was stripped away. By 11:17 hours, the complete reversal was finished. 13 Americans were now prisoners. 84 German prisoners were now freed. The Hauptmann stood before Funk with an expression that mixed respect and satisfaction. "You are brave, Sergeant," he said, "but mathematics defeats bravery." The Germans collected the American weapons and stacked them in the corner of the farmhouse under guard. 13 M1 Garand rifles, Funk's Thompson submachine gun, grenades, ammunition, all piled together. They stripped the Americans of maps, compasses, and rations, but left canteens and first aid kits. The Hauptmann ordered the Americans move to the barn to separate them from the German soldiers and avoid confusion. Funk and his 12 men were marched 25 yards across frozen ground to a barn that measured 30 by 40 feet. 4 German guards were assigned to watch them, older soldiers who looked tired. At 11:25 hours, another truck arrived with 35 additional Wehrmacht soldiers. These were engineers with demolition equipment. At 11:33 hours, a motorcycle courier brought orders for the Hauptmann. At 11:38 hours, another infantry unit arrived on foot, 40 more soldiers with different regiment markings. Funk kept counting. 110 in the original group, plus 35 engineers, plus 40 infantry. That made 185 Germans. At 11:42 hours, a final group arrived, 28 soldiers from mixed units, stragglers being collected into the defensive force. The total German strength reached 213 soldiers. Combined with the 84 freed prisoners, there were now 297 Germans in the immediate area. From inside the barn, Funk watched through gaps in the wooden walls as the Hauptmann organized his men. The German officer was establishing Holzheim as a defensive strongpoint. machine gun positions went up at the village approaches. Engineers constructed anti-tank obstacles. Communication lines were laid. Ammunition was distributed. This wasn't a random collection of retreating soldiers. This was a professional military force preparing to fight, and Funk's relief patrol of 20 men was going to walk straight into an ambush if they arrived now. The 4 German guards assigned to watch the American prisoners were all in their 50s, too old for frontline combat, but still capable of guard duty. They carried carabiner 98K rifles, bolt-action weapons that required manual cycling between shots. None of them had submachine guns. They positioned themselves at the barn entrance and corners, maintaining clear sight lines to their captives while the sound of German organisation echoed from outside. Hammers striking wood, orders being shouted, the rumble of more vehicles arriving. The Hauptmann was transforming Holzheim from a temporary position into a fortress. Funk assessed his personal situation with the same cold calculation he had used planning the original assault. 13 American prisoners of war held in a barn by 4 aging guards. Weapons stacked 25 yards away in the farmhouse, visible through the open door when soldiers moved past. No realistic escape route through 200 armed Germans establishing defensive positions in every direction. Night would fall around 17:30 hours, roughly 6 hours away. The Germans would almost certainly move their prisoners after dark to a more secure location farther from American lines. Once moved, rescue became impossible. The relief patrol that should have arrived by 1145 hours had either been rerouted or was approaching cautiously after detecting the German build-up. Either way, external rescue wasn't coming in time. At 11:47 hours, the Hauptmann entered the barn to inspect his new prisoners. He spoke English with the careful precision of a man who had studied the language in school and used it in interrogations. "You gentlemen will be treated correctly according to the Geneva Convention," he said. He asked Funk about American positions and unit strength. Funk provided only his name, rank, and serial number. The Hauptmann didn't press the issue. "Understandable," he said. "You are professional." He offered cigarettes, German tobacco that smelled harsh and bitter. 8 of the 13 Americans accepted. The Hauptmann explained the situation as he understood it. The war would end soon. Perhaps weeks, perhaps months. His orders were to hold Holzheim until receiving retreat authorization from division headquarters. That might take days or a week. The American prisoners would remain as his guests until then. The Hauptmann left seeming satisfied. His 4 guards visibly relaxed. The prisoners were secured. The situation was hopeless, and there was nothing 13 exhausted Americans could do against 200 organized Germans. But at 11:52 hours, Funk noticed details the Hauptmann had overlooked. The guards were tired from rapid deployment, standing in positions they had held for nearly an hour without relief. They leaned against barn posts and shifted their weight constantly. Their rifles remained slung over shoulders rather than held at ready. The farmhouse door stood open 25 yards away. The captured American weapons were visible in the corner, and from Funk's angle near the barn entrance, he could see his Thompson submachine gun resting on top of the pile with its 30-round stick magazine still inserted. The Hauptmann had made an assumption. He had assumed that 13 captured Americans, surrounded by 200 Germans, would accept their situation as hopeless and wait quietly for the war to end or for transfer to a proper prisoner camp. It was a reasonable assumption. Most men in similar circumstances would have reached the same conclusion. Mathematics didn't lie. 13 against 200 was suicide, not strategy. But the Hauptmann didn't know about Funk's 3 combat jumps, or the silver star in his jacket pocket, or the reputation he had built by doing exactly what his officers thought was impossible. Funk had killed Germans in Sicily by attacking at night when doctrine said to wait for daylight. He had captured a German strongpoint in Italy by approaching through a minefield everyone said was impassable. He had held a position in Normandy for 16 hours against counterattacks because retreat would have exposed his flanks. The 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment had learned that Sergeant Funk didn't respect mathematical impossibility. He simply found the angle nobody else had considered and hit it hard enough to make the mathematics change. At 12:05 hours, Funk began his tactical assessment. Distance to the farmhouse measured 25 yards or 75 feet. At combat sprint speed, that translated to roughly 6 or 7 seconds. German reaction time would require 2 to 3 seconds to recognize the threat and another 2 to 3 seconds to aim and fire. That created a response window of 4 to 6 seconds total. Funk would be under fire for at least 1 second, possibly 3 during his approach. The Thompson's capabilities were burned into his memory from hundreds of training hours. 700 rounds per minute meant the weapon could empty its entire 30-round magazine in approximately 2.5 seconds. The effective range was 50 yards. At 25 yards, every round would hit center mass. But Funk's plan wasn't about killing 200 Germans with a Thompson submachine gun. That was Hollywood mathematics, not combat reality. His plan was about creating an impossible situation for the Hauptmann, forcing the German officer to make the same calculation Funk had made an hour earlier when the roles were reversed. Recaptured prisoners didn't attack their captors. That violated every expectation, every assumption about human behavior under stress. The psychology of the situation favored audacity over caution. Germans believed the circumstances were stable because captured prisoners accepted their capture. Professional soldiers understood when they were beaten. The Hauptmann had deployed his 213 men across the village in defensive positions that made tactical sense for repelling an American advance, but left them spread thin. Only about 20 Germans remained in the immediate farmhouse area. The rest were scattered at machine gun positions, anti-tank obstacles, communication posts. If fighting erupted suddenly in the barn, those scattered soldiers would require 30 to 40 seconds to respond, longer if they needed to understand what was happening before they moved. The confined space of the farmhouse worked against massed response. German soldiers couldn't all fire at once without shooting each other. The freed prisoners, 84 men who had just been liberated and were now milling around without weapons or clear orders, would become obstacles rather than assets if bullets started flying. The Hauptmann was a professional officer who would recognize immediately that a firefight in these conditions would slaughter his own men along with the Americans. Professional soldiers chose negotiation over bloodbath when the mathematics favored neither side. Funk understood he wasn't planning a military victory. He was planning a psychological checkmate. If he could reach the Thompson and create enough chaos in the critical first 10 seconds, the Hauptmann would face an impossible choice. Order an assault that would kill dozens of his own soldiers in crossfire, or accept that an American sergeant had just reversed the capture through pure aggressive insanity. The German officer would make the professional choice because that's what professionals did. They minimized casualties when possible and saved their men for battles that mattered. At 12:18 hours, Funk began positioning himself closer to the barn door. He moved slowly over the course of 10 minutes, appearing to pace restlessly the way anxious prisoners did. He stretched his legs, rolled his shoulders, walked back and forth within the space the guards allowed. What he was actually doing was measuring exact distances and angles. Guard 1 stood 8 feet to the right of the door. Guard 2 stood 6 feet to the left. Guard 3 watched from the back corner, 15 feet away. Guard 4 remained outside, visible through a gap in the boards. Funk used subtle gestures to signal his men, movements that looked like nervous habits but carried meaning. When I move, you move. Take the guards. The Americans understood. They had fought together through 3 campaigns and knew their sergeant didn't signal unless he had a plan. At 12:26 hours, the Hauptmann exited the farmhouse and walked toward a vehicle to examine maps on the hood. His back was turned to the barn. Senior officer exposed and distracted. optimal moment. At 12:28 hours, Funk made his decision. He leaned close to the nearest American and whispered instructions. "On my move. Take the guards. I'm going for the Thompson." The soldier nodded and passed the message to the others. 13 Americans tensed like springs wound to breaking point. At 12:31 hours, Funk exploded into motion. 2 steps covered the distance to guard 1. Funk's elbow struck the man's jaw with the full force of his body weight behind it. The guard dropped unconscious before his brain could process what had happened. Funk stripped the carabiner rifle from the falling man's hands. Total elapsed time was 1.5 seconds. Simultaneously, his 12 men attacked the other guards with the coordinated violence of trained paratroopers. Guard 2 disappeared under 3 Americans who tackled him to the frozen ground. Guard 3 tried to raise his weapon but was overwhelmed before he could aim. Guard 4, outside the barn, was punched through the door gap by a fist that came from nowhere. All 4 guards were neutralized in 4 seconds total. Germans across the village began reacting. Shouts echoed between buildings. Soldiers turned toward the sound of fighting. Funk didn't pause to observe their response. He sprinted toward the farmhouse with the captured rifle in his hands. 25 yards at full combat speed. Germans saw him, and confusion rippled through their ranks. Was the prisoner escaping? Attacking? 3 seconds into his sprint, Germans started shouting warnings. At 5 seconds, they began raising weapons but slowly, uncertain whether to shoot a lone running man. At 6 seconds, Funk reached the farmhouse door. He dropped the carabiner and grabbed his Thompson from the weapon pile. The magazine was still seated. He pulled the charging handle and chambered a round with the metallic snap that every soldier recognized. 7 seconds elapsed. 8 seconds. He spun to face the approaching Germans with the Thompson's barrel sweeping across the farmhouse yard. The Hauptmann was turning from his map table, reaching for the pistol on his belt. 20 Germans in the immediate area had weapons unslung but not aimed. They had been organizing defensive positions, not expecting a prisoner assault. The frozen moments stretched like pulled wire. Everyone processed an impossibility. The American prisoner sergeant they had disarmed 4 minutes earlier now stood among them holding a submachine gun capable of firing 700 rounds per minute. The Thompson's barrel moved across German bodies in a slow arc that promised everyone in that yard would die if anyone pulled a trigger. Funk's finger rested on the weapon's trigger. The Hauptmann's hand stopped halfway to his pistol. 20 German soldiers stood with rifles partially raised in various stages of readiness. Behind Funk, his 12 Americans emerged from the barn carrying the guards' captured weapons. At 12:42 hours and 8 seconds after Funk grabbed the Thompson, absolute silence held the farmhouse yard. The Hauptmann stood frozen with his pistol half drawn from its holster. 20 Germans had weapons in various stages of readiness, but none actually aimed. The moment stretched across 2 seconds that felt like entire minutes. Then Funk spoke in German, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who had already decided how this would end. "Drop your weapons, now!" The Hauptmann's face cycled through shock, disbelief, and rapid calculation. He was doing the same mathematics Funk had done an hour earlier when their positions were reversed. His variables were simple and brutal. Funk's Thompson was aimed directly at his chest and would kill him first. The close quarters meant crossfire would kill the 84 freed German prisoners standing confused in the farmhouse yard. The Americans in the barn were now armed with captured rifles. The Thompson's rate of fire would cut down everyone in the immediate area before his scattered soldiers could respond. His 180 men spread across the village weren't in position to help without shooting through their own comrades. 5 seconds of silence passed. Germans throughout the farmhouse area waited for their commander's order. The Hauptmann had 3 choices: draw his pistol and die along with dozens of his men in the resulting chaos, order an assault that would slaughter Germans and prisoners together, or surrender again and preserve his soldiers for retreat that everyone knew was coming eventually. At 12:42 hours and 13 seconds, the Hauptmann slowly raised his hands above his head. He spoke in German. Ich ergebe mich. I surrender. His order to his troops came immediately. Waffen fallen lassen. Drop your weapons. 20 Germans in the farmhouse area complied. Rifles clattered to frozen ground. Funk's 12 men emerged fully from the barn and took up positions around the disarmed Germans. The second role reversal was complete in 30 seconds. But 180 Germans remained armed at positions scattered throughout the village. Funk understood the situation was balanced on the thinnest possible edge. He shouted in German toward the village positions where machine gunners and riflemen watched from windows and barricades. "This is the American sergeant. Your commander is my prisoner. More Americans are arriving. Surrender now, or he dies." The statement about reinforcements was a bluff, but the threat against the Hauptmann was absolutely real. Germans in the village began shouting to each other, debating whether to attack and risk killing their own officer. The Hauptmann made the decision for them. He shouted orders across Holzheim. All soldiers, surrender. No resistance. His calculation was professional rather than emotional. The war was nearly over. Unnecessary casualties served no purpose. The American sergeant had proven willing to risk everything. Fighting in these conditions would create a slaughter that accomplished nothing except filling graves. The professional choice was to preserve his men for whatever came next. At 12:47 hours, Germans began emerging from their positions. The first group of 15 soldiers came from the nearest building with weapons raised overhead in surrender. Then 22 soldiers abandoned the machine gun positions. Engineers appeared next, 35 men carrying demolition equipment. The mathematics reversed completely. Started with 13 Americans capturing 84 Germans. Then 200 Germans recaptured those 13 Americans. Now 13 Americans held 213 Germans at gunpoint, plus the original 84 prisoners for a total of 297. The ratio stood at 22 Germans for every American captor. By 12:55 hours, all 213 Wehrmacht soldiers were disarmed and gathered in groups under American guard. The absurdity of the situation became apparent to everyone involved. Some of the younger Germans started laughing because the circumstances were too ridiculous for any other response. The Hauptmann's expression mixed professional respect with genuine disbelief. He had fought Russians on the Eastern Front, British in North Africa, Americans in France. Never had he seen such fearlessness or madness, and he wasn't certain there was any difference between the two. At 13:02 hours, the American relief patrol finally arrived. 20 soldiers led by a lieutenant who stopped at the village edge and radioed back to company headquarters. The transmission was brief and confusing. "Funk has captured an entire German company." The response requested clarification. "Did you say platoon?" "Negative," the lieutenant said. "Company. Over 200 prisoners. One sergeant with a Thompson." Radio silence followed. Then a voice asked him to repeat the information because it couldn't possibly be correct. Additional American forces arrived by 13:15 hours. A full company of 140 men deployed to secure the prisoners and begin processing. German soldiers were searched, separated by rank, and documented. The final count reached 213 Wehrmacht soldiers captured in the reversal, plus 84 recaptured from the original morning operation. A total of 297 Germans were taken by 13 Americans. Equipment seized included weapons for an entire company, ammunition, maps showing defensive plans for the entire sector, and a functioning radio. The intelligence value alone justified the mission 10 times over. The Hauptmann was interrogated by American intelligence officers. He provided information professionally, answering questions about unit strengths and positions with the cooperation expected from a captured officer. When asked to explain how Sergeant Funk had recaptured his entire force, the Hauptmann struggled for words. "I have fought on 3 fronts," he said. "Never seen such fearlessness. Or madness. Perhaps they are the same thing." One intelligence officer asked Funk how many rounds he had fired from the Thompson during the recapture. Funk ejected the magazine and showed them. It was still fully loaded. 30 rounds. The entire reversal had been accomplished on threat alone, without fire in a single shot. In February 1945, Funk was recommended for the Medal of Honor. The citation described conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. It specifically mentioned his recapture of superior armed forces after being captured himself, an action unprecedented in modern warfare. President Truman presented the medal in June 1945. Funk survived the war and lived until 1993, dying at age 74. The Thompson submachine gun that reversed the mathematics at Holzheim remained in family possession for decades before being donated to a military museum, where it sits in a display case that most visitors walk past without stopping. It looks like any other weapon from the war, but it represents the moment when one sergeant proved that audacity and speed could defeat mathematics, that professional soldiers on both sides understood when surrender made more sense than slaughter, and that sometimes the craziest plan was simply to refuse accepting that 200 armed enemies made capture permanent.